Hi, folks. My name is Michaela Douglas. I'm a museum coordinator with the Frisco Historic Park and Museum. I am here to introduce Dave Lively for our third installment of the virtual lunchtime lecture, or fourth installment of our virtual lunchtime lecture series. Dave creates programs and conducts tours highlighting local history for groups large and small. His knowledge and passion for the west side of the Rocky Mountain National Park and the stories he shares that they're the remarkable characters from the past bring deeper understanding and appreciation for where we are today. Living less than half a mile from where his family homesteaded, near the entrance of Rocky Mountain National Park, Dave is a well-known local historian, certified interpretive guide, and certified tour guide with unsurpassed knowledge and passion for the region and is committed to the highest standards of professionalism and ethics. He appears in The Living Dream, 100 Years of Rocky Mountain National Park, documentary on PBS, and he was the past president of the Grand Lake Area Historic Society and the Grand County Historical Association, and the past vice chair of the Slope representative of Colorado Preservation, Inc. This is why he is the great speaker. So I will turn it over to Dave. Thank you all so much. We'll see you later. Don't forget to ask questions.
Michaela, thank you. And I want to welcome everyone also to a wonderful afternoon. I'm coming to you from my home in Grand Lake, Colorado, and I hope you have an opportunity to visit Grand Lake and enter Rocky Mountain National Park. With that, I think we'll jump right into the program called Rocky's West Side Stories. Again, I'm Dave Lively with Live Tours and Talks. You'll see this information again at the end if you need to contact me, either email or on Facebook. I also do historic driving tours, private guided tours into Rocky Mountain National Park. For a lot of you that may not be familiar with Rocky Mountain National Park and just outside of the town of Grand Lake, you can see by this map that Grand Lake is the second largest city in Colorado. Well, not really. We have about 2,000 people that live here. But if you were coming, for instance, out of the Denver area, you would come west on Interstate 70 to highway intersection mile marker 242. You would jump on US Highway 40, come over the top of Berthoud Pass. You pass through the communities of Winter Park, Fraser, Tabernash, Granby, and then you turn onto Highway 34. That'll take you 17 miles north to the town of Grand Lake. And just a mile and a half beyond that on the same highway is the entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. Let's talk about the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. Some people call it the wetter, better side of Rocky Mountain National Park. Rocky Mountain National Park. Just those words. Sometimes that might bring a sense of wilderness, wildlife, wonder. But what about the people? What about the people that were here before Rocky Mountain National Park was established and the people that have come since? And today, that's what I'd like to talk to you about. Share some of their stories and some of their ideas. I want to go way back in time. I need to back up about 4,000 years ago when we had the Archaic Indians in the area. Please forgive me, sometimes I'm not totally politically correct. I use the word Indian instead of Native American sometimes. But the Archaic Indian came and they built these rock walls that you see. Sometimes they would be 2 and 3 feet high, and they would put them a quarter of a mile wide from each other. And then as you went about a half a mile long, it would narrow down to a very fine point. At that point, the braves were laying behind the rocks with their spears, because this was before the invention of the bow and arrow. And when an animal came walking by, well, they opened the grocery store with their spear and just feed the family and half of the tribe. This went on for several hundred years. Most of these people lived right at timberline, just where the trees stopped growing. These rock walls still exist today. Some of them literally are 4,000 years old. And along the top of the Continental Divide throughout Colorado, I know more than 154 miles of these walls that still exist today. I want to bump forward again in time from there. Let's go back to roughly 400 to 600 years ago. We had the Ute Indian come through, and the Ute were a mountain Indian. They stayed primarily in the mountains of what is now Colorado, except in the wintertime. It was only the white man that was foolish enough to think that we could deal with all that snow in the wintertime. But the Ute would come up and stay in what is now the Grand Lake area, and they would pass through what is now Rocky Mountain National Park. They left a series of trails that they had established. Here's one, a great picture of the Child's Trail at the top. They had the Child's Trail and the Big Trail and the Dog's Trail. This trail that you see, there's a rock cairn right next to it, and that would allow them to see the trail a half a mile ahead. If you look closely in the background, you might be able to pick out what is now Trail Ridge Road. There's actually cars parked on it. This picture is from the 1970s, and that trail was so worn from several hundred years ago that it still exists today. It's hard to see it now in the weeds and the grasses that have grown up, but they used these trails for hundreds of years and would go back and forth across the top of the mountain. They had homes on both sides of the mountains, and the Ute home started out as a wickiup. This would have just a center tree, and they cut some smaller trees, and as you can see, just leaned against the middle tree, a bunch of branches and mud around to keep the rain, mud, and the weather out. But they would return to these homes year after year after year. They'd go back to this one in the summer and here on this side and across the top of the mountain to their homes on the east side. If you look at the trench in front of that, you can see that that home was used for centuries. Look at how they trod down that pathway to get to their home and others. Well, finally, in the 1700s, the Spanish came into what is now southern Colorado, and they introduced the horse to the Ute and to other Native Americans throughout America. But the Ute became very, very proficient horse people. They really did. But the horse allowed all Native Americans to change their style now. They could now be more mobile, and they could hunt better. They could now chase buffalo and larger elk and that kind of thing instead of eating rabbits and small deer, for instance. But it also allowed them to adapt to the teepee system. They would cut the long poles, of course, and cover them now with buffalo hides that they had obtained because they could hunt the buffalo with the horses. And they just tie it behind the horse and let the horse drag it. America's first mobile home. But the teepee allowed them to move in all kinds of different directions and keep going. Well, a few hundred years later, literally about 200 years ago, the Arapaho came into the area of what is now Colorado, and they came to the Front Range near where the Denver area is, and they would stay there off and on for several years and go to the mountains. And like all of us, they said, wow, what do you think's over that next hill? Don't we all just wander over the next hill anyway? And they started wandering up, and they found what is now considered the Estes Park Valley area. And they found these trails and said, wow, where do those go? So they just started following like anybody would. And they came up and over the top of the mountain, and this is what they saw, the Kawuneeche Valley. This is about a 35-mile long valley that was carved out by a glacier. And it now, as you can see in the lower part of the picture there, now has a beautiful river running down through the bottom of the valley. And the Arapaho said this would be a perfect place for us to camp. But you know, up and down the Kawanichi Valley, there were already 7 or 8 campsites of Ute. The Ute did not visit here every year. They'd come for 2 or 3, 4 summers, and then they'd leave and let the land recover. And their campsites were settled by bands of Ute. They lived in a small band, usually of about, roughly 30 to 40 people, almost always the same family. And in this valley that you see, they could have had 7 or 8 of these campsites. Well, the Arapaho kind of moved in, and yes, they did battle each other for land usually, but they got along almost all the time. There's several great battles, stories of great battles around the Grand Lake area. We're not going to have time to go into all of those, but the Arapaho and Ute, they almost lived quietly next to each other. Most of us have seen too many John Wayne movies. We think of the different tribes being at battle with each other every single day of the week, and it just wasn't a reality. They got along, but most of the time when they had a battle, it was over land. Oh, I like where you're laying. Look at that. You're camped on the side of the river. That's where I want to be. How about we just take it away from you? So in the distance, you can see a larger meadow in that picture, almost in the middle. And that is where the Arapaho had one of their favorite campgrounds, because that was their horse race track. They would stand a brave at each end of that big meadow and race their horses around. Gambling was heavy, long before we ever had legalized gambling in Colorado. We're talking hundreds of years before gambling here. But the Arapaho had their horse race track, and they would have a brave, as I mentioned, at each end of the meadow and race. The big race, and I get the feeling this might have been once a month or maybe even once a summer, but the big race to top it off, when you lost your horse. And of course, horses were very, very valuable to everybody. But that meadow has a creek running through it. It's named Onahu, Onahu. Onahu is an Arapaho word that translates to warms himself. As we've seen on some of the Western movies, the Native Americans often had a big communal fire at night. And the Arapaho did this. The Ute did not. They normally had just individual little campfires around their teepees and their wickiups. But the Arapaho had a big fire in the evening, and they had one of their favorite racehorses. And in the evening, he would kind of sneak over by the fire and warm himself up a little bit, and they'd push him away. And, pretty soon here he'd come back sneaking over by the fire. They named that horse Onahu, warms himself. Well, the stream that runs through the middle of that meadow is where the horse died. He died next to that stream, so they named the stream Onahu after one of their favorite racehorses. Just because that's how life was at the time. Well, the Arapaho continued on, and here's another great shot of that meadow that I was just talking about, the stream. But you can see it's a pretty good sized meadow, so it gave them lots of room to have their campsite. As we move on, many years later, in the early 1800s, we had trappers come to the area. They were looking for beaver for felt hats, and a lot of them were French trappers. They started many, many, many miles south and west of what is now Grand Lake. And they found a very large river, and they named it the Grand River, just because of its size. Well, they said any river that's this big, it needs kind of a lake as a headwaters to get it started, to let this water down. So they just worked their way from beaver dam to beaver dam upstream, and they finally followed the river and saw this great mountain and this area, and then they continued on. Well, they walked up and over that hill, and they found the lake that they were looking for, and they named it Grand Lake, after the Grand River that flows out of it. Okay? There are a couple other versions of how Grand Lake got its name, but the most prominent one is the French trappers of the naming of Grand Lake. This is the river north of town that also comes down and joins the Colorado River. Excuse me. The Grand River flowed out of Grand Lake. Well, we had another trapper that came to the area, and he built this small cabin on the side of Grand Lake. His name was Philip Crawshaw. That's all we know about him. He carved his name on the inside of the cabin, or we wouldn't know that much about him. It appears that he would come and use his cabin as a trapping, just a place to live while he was here trapping. And apparently he would be here for 2, maybe 3 summers, and then leave for 2 or 3 summers and then come back occasionally. But we honestly don't know hardly anything about him, except for the fact that he, as I mentioned, scrawled his name inside the wall. Well, another gentleman came to the area in 1867. His name was Joseph Wesket. And at first, he just moved into Philip Crawshaw's cabin. A few years later, there were more people coming to the area, and so Wesket built himself a little bit larger place to stay. He also was the first white person that we know of to stay year-round in the Grand Lake area. We do call him our first permanent settler. A couple of years later, a young couple came up and they said, the mountains are so beautiful, we'd like to get married up here. Well, Joseph Wesket said, well, you know, you can ride horseback over to our county seat over in Hot Sulphur Springs, but that's a 5.5-hour horseback ride each way. Why don't I just marry you? And after that, he called him a judge. He called himself a judge, and he was known for years and years and years. We still call him Judge Wesket as a nickname. So he just called himself a judge. You know, that 6-gun he has, that might have helped him also to keep everybody from questioning his, shall we say, capabilities as a judge. We have riches in the mountains of Colorado, but are they always a monetary, or are there other things in the mountains of Colorado that are also very, very rich? We had gold and silver in the area. In the 1880s, early 1880s, a gentleman came to visit the town of Grand Lake from the village of Fort Collins across the top of the mountain. And he was visiting some friends. He went up the valley and he stumbled across a little bit of silver. Called his buddy from Fort Collins to come over. That man shut down his store and came over to mine gold and silver. They were going to be rich like nobody had ever seen. They never got rich because this is how they lived up here. In the 1880s, most of the gold mining and silver mining around the state of Colorado, it was winding down. And so we had a lot of men out looking for jobs in the mining. And so they found out they had a little gold and silver north of Grand Lake. The rush was on and they just came up. But a lot of them, because they had been miners before and had settled down a little bit, now some of them brought their wives with them. We had numerous cities up and down that 35-mile valley that I talked about. We actually had Grand Lake City, which is where Joseph Wesket was, and Gillette and Fairfax and Teller City. Lulu City was probably our biggest town in the Kawuneeche Valley. It's reported to have had between 250 and 300 people in it, unless you listen to and read some of the old newspapers account where they said they had 700 and 800 people there. It wasn't near big enough to support that many people. But all of these towns they didn't last very long at all. Some of the towns lasted less than a year. Some of them lasted 6 years, but the gold wasn't any good. And the silver was such low quality and quantity that nobody would come here and process the ore. In other words, they stamp the rocks with a big stamp mill and beat the rocks up until they find some of the gold in the middle of them. Well, the quality of our gold was very poor and the quantity was almost non-existent, so nobody would bring a stamp mill to the area. These miners were loading rocks in their wagon and they would hook up their horses to it and haul it 65 miles over the top of the mountain to the town of Georgetown to have their rocks processed. And sometimes they'd find as little as $2 or $3 or $4 worth of gold in them. Well, of course, the saloons in Georgetown took care of that $3 or $4 pretty quick. So the guys were always coming back broke because their gold just wasn't any good. And we had numbers of them. Here's the town of Lulu City. You can see these buildings are just simply miner shacks. They had holes in the wall. They weren't very well built. They just lived here a few years. But this is one of the wives that was there. I don't know what she thinks she's going to be sweeping out there on that dirt trail. But Lulu City did have some saloons. Yes, the saloons did have women that, let's just say they worked mostly in the evenings. And the wives kept those women pretty much under control and told them who they could see and how often they could see their husbands and stuff like that. But yes, there were women there because it wasn't, all the men were not married by any stretch. But again, Lulu City didn't last very long. As I mentioned, if you look at the walls, they had a little bit of chinking in between the logs to keep some of the wind out. But they also had grizzly bears at the time. We haven't had a grizzly bear in the Grand Lake area since 1922, but they did have wolves and grizzly bears. Well, grizzlies have a strong sense of smell, and from a couple miles away, the grizzly bear might say, Betty's cooking again tonight. That smells pretty darn good. Why don't I just go visit him? So they had a grizzly bear problem in Lulu City, and they actually built themselves a grizzly bear trap. It would have been similar to a small log cabin, and it had a door that lifted toward the inside and tied up with some rope and string. And when the bear came in and ate the bait at the far end of it, the door would slam down behind him. And of course, they just kill it and eat it and use the bear skin for rugs and or clothing and stuff like that. But the grease was very valuable. Grizzly bears are very greasy meat. But the women would put the grease from the bears in a tin can and keep it sometimes for years. And that's what they would cook with. That was their cooking grease. Okay. Just a few years later, 1889, this was what was left of some of Lulu City. The roofs already caving in from the snow in the summertime. You might also pay attention to beyond the cabins. Those are pine beetle killed trees, just like we have in Rocky Mountain National Park right now, just like we had in the 1920s, just like we will have again. The pine beetles just go underground until the trees are real dry. And of course, any of you that have traveled in the mountains of Colorado, you've seen this going on for, golly, almost 20 years now. But this is Lulu City in 1889, already starting to fall down. This picture was taken many years later, of course, because there's a national park ranger there with his hat, but that's the bear trap that they had in Lulu City. The bear trap existed for many, many years. People would climb on it and they pull nails out of it for souvenirs and bits and pieces of wood and stuff. Finally, I think it was about 10, 12 years ago, there was a little boy climbing on the remnants of it, and he fell and got hurt and broke an arm and stuff. So the national park has removed it. They've taken all remnants out. There are no remnants in Lulu City anymore. There's a hiking trail to it, a very well-known, a very easy hiking trail to Lulu City. But all that is there, it now remains a sign that says this used to be Lulu City. Well, a number of other locations in the area, such as the village of Grand Lake. This is the village that we know today. Some of those buildings were built in 1910 to 1912, and they burned down. There's a hotel just off the center of the picture that was burned down in 1913. But that main street that you see is still Grand Avenue today. It's Main Street or the Main Street of Grand Lake. Its name is not Main Street because Joseph Wesket had started the city of Grand Lake City on the other side of the lake, and his main area and Main Street, he named Main Street. So when you visit Grand Lake today, you are not on Main Street, you're on Grand Avenue. And we certainly hope that you enjoy it being 100 feet wide. You know, most mining communities especially, when they laid out a town, their streets were basically wide enough so you could pass two wagons beside each other. And that was how wide their streets became, with a little bit of boardwalk in between the buildings. Well, Grand Lake designed it, the village of Grand Lake that we know today, designed their downtown area 100 feet wide so they could host the rodeos in the middle of the street. And now, of course, we have great parking because of that, unlike some other small communities that fight hard for parking on their main avenue through town because it's so darn narrow. There's a saying that many of you from Colorado have seen and heard before. Whiskey, that was made for drinking. Water, that exists only to fight over. It was just for fighting, and it still is. We move water all over the place anytime we choose to. You know, we had some farmers and ranchers out in eastern Colorado plains. They would look to the west and they'd say, look at that white stuff up there. We know that that white stuff turns into water in the springtime. How can we get that white stuff to water our crops down in eastern Colorado? So in the 1889, they had surveyors wandering around the mountains of Colorado, and they stumbled across the Kawuneeche Valley, and they stumbled across the mountain range that the Arapaho called Never No Summer, because the snow is up there all summer long, a little bit of it anyway. And they said, what if we captured some of that snow melt in a ditch, diverted it north across the Continental Divide into the Poudre River, down to the Platte River, and irrigate crops in eastern Colorado? And that's what they decided to do. So in 1890, they started digging on the Grand River Ditch. It's named that. We still call it the Grand Ditch, but it was named the Grand River Ditch because the water it was capturing would normally go to the river and flow downhill. Well, they started digging on this ditch. As you can see, they had manual labor, a little bit of dynamite here and there, but it was hard to come by sometimes. But they had different ethnicities working on the ditch. They would have Irish and Swedish and some Mexicans and some Japanese. You know, our cultures were different before the turn of the last century. In 1890s and early 1900s, these ditch diggers would build themselves houses along the side of the ditch to live in while they were digging the ditch, except for the Japanese, because the other cultures would not allow the Japanese to share a house with them. So the Japanese would dig holes into the side of the mountain, and that's where they got to live. Well, the Grand River Ditch, this is a picture that I took about 4 years ago. It still runs today. It's full of water. That's just an inspection road. I wish we could all drive up that road and see it, but you can walk along the ditch. It's, you can tell by this picture, it's only 10 or 12 feet wide at the top, about 10, 15 feet deep, and it still flows downhill at a 2% grade. When they were digging the ditch, though, when all those people were digging, they only made it about 3, maybe 3.5 miles in the first 3 summers. But the water started flowing, and the ranchers and farmers in eastern Colorado, well, you know what they said. Hey, that's some pretty good stuff. Can we have some more of that? So they came back and started digging on the ditch again for another 3-4 miles. A few years later, the ranchers and farmers said, hey, I still like some more of that water. And so over a period of many years, they extended the ditch. The ditch now runs 16.5 miles long, and it was finished in 1947. So they did use equipment beginning in the 1920s. They had some big steam shovels up there and stuff like that to help with the ditch. But now, because the ditch is 16.5 miles long, it captures almost 1/3 of the water that would normally have started the Grand River. It took a bunch of it out. The Grand River today is probably 6 inches to a foot lower than what it would have been back before they started digging on the ditch. Okay. Here's the ditch from the valley floor. You can tell they weren't very excited and very concerned either about the environment at the time. They just blast the rocks out and throw them over the side of the hill. Some of those piles of rocks are 15, 25 feet deep, and trees will never grow there again or anything like that. But in 1890s, 1900s, that's what they did. Okay. Another great water diversion program. This one didn't start until the 1930s. This is the Alva B Adams home, because the Front Range people especially the communities of Fort Collins and Greeley and northern Denver area, they said, you know, we'd like some drinking water. We'd like some water for our lawns and stuff like that. Why don't we dig a tunnel under Rocky Mountain National Park, and we'll hook up Grand Lake to it, and we'll just let the water come through the tunnel to Estes Park. We'll let it flow down the Big Thompson Canyon, and people can drink water out of it, water their lawns, a little bit of irrigation. So they started the Alva B Adams Tunnel. The problem was, if they would have just hooked this up to Grand Lake, it would have drained it in about 4 years. And Grand Lake is the largest natural lake in Colorado. So the Corps of Engineers got involved and said, well, you can't do that. You can't just drain a big natural lake like that. And so they created a series of reservoirs. So altogether, there are 7 reservoirs that are in this huge complex system all over western Colorado to feed water into Grand Lake so it can go through the Adams Tunnel to Lake S, which is one of the reservoirs they formed for this, and then down the Big Thompson River. Here's a great shot. You see the steam generator on the right-hand side. That was to generate electricity. Their train was electric, and they also had electric lights inside the tunnel. They got the tunnel finished and started filling the 2 reservoirs in the area. Both Shadow Mountain Lake and Granby Reservoir are part of the Colorado Big Thompson Project. They called it the Colorado Big Thompson Project because they're now taking water out of the Colorado River and feeding it to the Big Thompson River, because the Grand River was changed to the Colorado River in 1921. If you want to be honest about it, it was pure political finagling. Our state legislatures, such as Colorado and Utah, they used to only meet every other year, and Utah had the Colorado River running through it. But the name was given to it back in the 1700s by the Spanish, because they saw the red sandstone and the red color of the river, and they said, ooh, Colorado, the color red. Well, Utah has been stuck with the name Colorado since then, and they said, well, that's the name of a state next to us. We don't want to adapt that. So they didn't even like that name. Well, when we found out in 1830s that it was the same river, there was a little bit of a push in Colorado to change the name of the Grand River to the Colorado. That push never went anywhere. They played with the idea for many, many decades. And finally, in 1921, when the state legislature of both Colorado and Utah were not meeting, the governor called a special session and brought the legislature into Colorado and said, let's finalize this deal and change the name to Colorado. Within 1 week, they had done all the paperwork. They got the name changed to Colorado. They sent it to Congress. They put their rubber stamp on it. And that's how the Grand River became the Colorado River. Grand Lake is the headwaters of the Colorado River, the same one that many of you might have seen when you've been to the Grand Canyon. It comes out a little smaller of Grand Lake than it is in the Grand Canyon. And, you know, if there were no dams on the Colorado River, which there are, it's the most dammed river in the United States, but if there were no dams on it, the water coming out of Grand Lake would be down in the Grand Canyon in about 5 days. But of course, there's lots of dams, starting with Shadow Mountain Dam 3 miles from Grand Lake. So the building that you're seeing now, this is a homestead cabin. Sam Stone came to the area and homesteaded and built himself this small cabin. I took this picture about 5 years ago just so you could see the logs where the black bears have been scratching to get the bugs out, a little bit of food. Sam Stone came here as a gold miner. Like everybody, he didn't make any money at all. But after the gold mines shut down, he stayed. He was living on the side of what is called Big Meadow, or what the Arapaho called Tonahutu. And he had hay that he could cut there and sell it to the other homesteaders that were coming into the area, because they were bringing some cattle with them so they could raise beef cattle to sell down in Denver. I would imagine and estimate that Sam probably never made more than $20 or $30 a year, but that's all he needed. He was almost a hermit. So they say he would come into town once a year, sometimes twice a year. Nobody ever saw him. So he didn't need much money. Many of the other homesteaders that came into the valley, this is the Harbison family. The 2 daughters in the middle there, Katie and Annie, they homesteaded. Each homesteaded 160 acres, about 1.5 miles from downtown Grand Lake. That's their mother on their left and their younger brother, Rob, on the right. Rob was only 19 when they got here. If he'd have been 21, there probably would have been 3 homesteads. But the 2 girls homesteaded and started raising dairy cattle. They started a dairy ranch to provide fresh milk for the townspeople of Grand Lake. Their ranch is now the west entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. Many of you may be familiar with the Grand Lake entrance, and when you drive through the pay gate, the toll booth there's a large meadow right there on your left that sometimes has a lot of elk all over it. That is the Harbison Ranch. The Harbisons didn't particularly care for the elk because they were eating their profits. That grass that you see out in those meadows, that's Timothy grass. They plowed and planted that grass because the local grass isn't real good for cows. So they plowed that grass. Well, the elk were in there eating that more nutritious grass, and the Harbisons were losing money. Not very much, but they weren't making that much money either. The Harbison Homestead House actually is the small building under the roof on the right-hand side. That building was about, approximately 10 by 12 feet. All 5 adults lived in there, and the first winter, their cow and the calf. They hadn't built a barn yet, and if they left the cow and the calf outdoors, they're frozen to death, and that was their dairy ranch. So many years later, they built what is called the big cabin on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, they added a kitchen unit to it. But that was their homestead in 1896. Okay. Another gentleman that came to the area as a gold miner, he was Bob Wheeler. He came and didn't do very good in the mining like everybody else, but he left for many years. And he was in the Spanish-American War in 1898. We have no indication that he actually knew Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War, but he probably had been introduced to him. But Bob Wheeler in 1906 had heard that, people were riding from Estes Park by horseback over to Grand Lake. They were called tourists. So they would ride their horseback for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, just to make that journey. Well, Bob Wheeler said, I wonder what would happen if I built a hotel on the Grand Lake side at the bottom of that trail. I bet I could charge them $1 a night. This was 1906. $1 a night was very expensive. So that's what he decided to do. Part of it was that the people in Estes Park where you rented your horse would tell you that go over to Bob Wheeler's Camp Wheeler. He will fix you a great home-cooked meal. Bob was considered just a wonderful, wonderful cook, and he really was, okay? But he also built what he called tent cabins for you to stay in for this $1 a night. Here's a view from up on the hillside. If you look down to the lower left corner, you'll see Bob's house down there, and in the sunlight, he had tent cabins. They were, logs about 3 feet high, and then just a canvas top for the tent part of it. But you knew when you saw this from your horseback, there's a cot in the corner of that. You get off of the ground. You'd been living on your bedroll on the ground for the last week or two. So you looked down there and you saw the cot in the tents, and you saw a home-cooked meal. Oh, look out back. There's the Grand River. That's a bath. I won't smell like my horse for a day. You'd hit the trifecta now. So Bob Wheeler did have a lot of people stay there. He expanded it. He sold it finally. His health wasn't real great, so he sold in 1927 and moved down to the Denver metro area. And there had been a gentleman that had stayed with Bob Wheeler when Bob Wheeler was calling it Hotel de Hardscrabble, a lot of work with very little return. But Bob also had a nickname. His nickname was Squeaky Bob Wheeler. As far as we can find out, when he was a little boy, he had real throat problems, as they called it. We think it's probably what we would call severe strep throat today. But after that, every time he got excited, his voice would squeak. And Bob Wheeler got excited a lot, especially when he was showing people around his land and stuff like that. But so they always called him Squeaky Bob Wheeler. Well, this visitor came and he told Bob, he said, I'm going to come back here someday and I'm going to buy this place and I'm going to change the name of it. He was actually the 4th owner of the place, and he put some new cabins in. Here's some sayings that Bob had. Just blow your nose and clean your shoes. What do you think about the rest of it? Just leave things as you find them. Everything will be just fine. And here's what it turned out to be. In the 1930s, the gentleman came and he built some of these rental cabins, and he did indeed rename it after the Arapaho and Ute that had been here. He called it the Phantom Valley Ranch, after the phantoms of the Arapaho. He had at one time over 18 of these little cabins. He had a capacity of about 65 people. All of these buildings are gone. The National Park Service has removed all lodges and resorts that were inside what is now Rocky. Some of them as early as the 30s, some of them as late as 1963. So there's no place to rent a cabin inside Rocky. And at one time, there were more than 30 resorts and lodges inside Rocky. Another homesteader that started out raising cows and found out that people were coming over the new road over the top of the mountain called Fall River Road, now in their Model Ts, and the ranch was right on the side of the road. He said, you know what? Why don't we build a hotel and start renting rooms out to these people? The Holsworth Trout Lodge was formed. They were right on the side of the Colorado River. John and Sophia Holsworth came to the area in 1917 because they had a saloon in Denver that was closed down due to prohibition. So they brought a still up to their house and started that up here. But John Sr. was injured, and his son Johnny took over the operation of the ranch when he was 22 years old. And he decided to build this trout lodge and bring tourists in. And Johnny was a great storyteller. They'd have a campfire in the evening and everything else that was associated with it at that time. And like a regular dude ranch. And most of what Johnny Holsworth told you was actually true. I wish I'd have gotten to know Johnny better. I did know him back in the 70s, early 70s before he passed away. But in 1914, they were trying to establish Rocky Mountain National Park. For those of you that are familiar with the Colorado area, the first proposal was to have it, the size of it was going to be from Estes Park to the Utah border. From the Wyoming border down below just where Idaho Springs is on Interstate 70. And Congress said, there's no way we're going to let you do that big. We can't fund it, not give you money for it or anything else. So they reduced it. And in 1914, the people in Estes Park were still working on putting this national park together that didn't have a name yet. And the Colorado Mountain Club asked them to be a part of putting it together. And two women from the Colorado Mountain Club got on a train and went to Wyoming to the Wind River Indian Reservation, and they met with some of the Arapaho. They said, do you remember any stories about the area you used to call Spirit or Holy Lake, which is now Grand Lake? And two of the gentlemen spoke up and said, we were little boys there. So they asked them to come back. They came back to Colorado with their interpreter. They put them on horses for 2 weeks. They wandered up on top of the mountains in what would become this new national park. They had their interpreter. They had a rancher from Estes who knew what the white man called the area, and another gentleman who took just copious notes that the interpreter gave him. This is the pack trip up on top of the pass. And they wandered around, as I mentioned, for 2 weeks. And because of that pack trip, Rocky Mountain National Park now has 36 sites that carry Arapaho names. You've already heard several of them. Onahu, the horse that warms himself. Tanahutu, meaning big meadow. Kawanichi is an Arapaho name. It does not mean coyote or coyote, if you prefer, valley. It's been misinterpreted for years and years and years. There's many places that still call it Coyote Valley. The Arapaho never called it Coyote Valley. They called it Haquihana Valley, the Valley of the Wolf. But the river that we called the Grand River and now the Colorado River was Kawanichi. The word Kawanichi in Arapaho translates loosely to the coyote river or stream. Kawa is coyote and Nichi is running water. So we've got the Kawanichi, which is the same as the Colorado River. They did establish Rocky Mountain National Park. Congress finally sent a bill through, and in January 26, 1915, President Woodrow Wilson established Rocky Mountain National Park. I like to say that we did not create Rocky Mountain National Park. We simply gave it a name. Everybody in Estes Park was ecstatic about this brand new national park. They said, we've got to throw a party. Let's celebrate. Let's have a good time. Who's going to snowshoe from Denver to Estes Park in January? Because in January, there were no roads to Estes Park. So they said, well, let's wait. We'll have a summer party. We'll have the sunshine. We'll have a big party and celebrate. So September 4th, 1915, they did the dedication to Rocky Mountain National Park. As you can see, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people showed up. And like usual in the mountains of Rocky Mountain National Park or the Frisco area, it rained off and on all day long. That's what happens when you throw a party in the mountains of Colorado. People tended to ignore it, and they had the wonderful dedication of Rocky. In 2015, they did a rededication of Rocky for the 100th anniversary. You know, many of us know this saying, as things change, they really tend to stay the same, don't they? Well, how about the entrance station? This is the first entrance station on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. The park ranger would stand there, hand out maps and tell you where you could camp and good things to see. He didn't collect any money. They didn't start charging to go into Rocky until 1931, and then it was $1 a car. But he'd stand there, and on a busy weekend, my golly, on a Saturday, he might see 15 or 20 cars a day. Yeah, not that many. Well, from that, we went to this entrance station. And you can tell by the age of the automobiles and that big wide spot that they'd stand and give you maps, and you were now charged to get into Rocky Mountain National Park. But the problem was that just beyond that entrance station, there's a road that takes off to the right. Well, that road leads to the Grand Lake Lodge. You had to pay an entrance fee into Rocky Mountain National Park to be a guest at the Grand Lake Lodge, because at that time, Grand Lake Lodge was located within Rocky Mountain National Park boundaries. It wasn't owned by the national park, it was a private entity. But so they decided to finally move that entrance station there to the third entrance station that we know of. This is the entrance today. And if you look up to the mountains, you'll see the mountains that the Arapaho called Never No Summer, or as we now call them, the Never Summer Range. You see the cut across the face of the mountain. That's the Grand River ditch that you see. And it's full of water. It's got water in it today. That water is all owned by a water company, and they sell the rights to use that water for irrigation in eastern Colorado. It's actually used 17 times and put back in the river between Estes Park and the Nebraska state line. What do you think? This was the top of Trail Ridge Road in 1957. Now, I don't want to make any generalizations, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but isn't that women standing in line at a restroom? They did it on the top of the mountain in 1957. And this picture I took 2 summers ago in a pouring down rainstorm. And there were women standing in line at the restroom. I'm not going to make fun of it. I've seen men stand there too, but it just had to be a comparison. But this is the new restrooms that they have on top of Trail Ridge Road. So some things do change, but sometimes they stay the same. This is the Kawanichi Visitor Center. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed a bill called Mission 66. It was for our national parks to have money for 10 years to do cleaning and fixing up our national parks, building new visitor centers. And this was the result on the west side. There's a wonderful visitor center on the east side called Beaver Meadows, but this was the one that was built on the west side. Mission 66 money didn't quite make it. This wasn't finished until 1971, but we're talking a federal government program. And it has stayed very much the same, except for the trees that have grown around it since 1961. Hidden back in those trees is the same building. They put a new roof over the restrooms outdoors. And other than that, the building hasn't changed much since 1971 when it was completed. It's got the same small offices that they had back then. Yes, the national park people do know I talk like this. One of our earliest park rangers on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. He was not the first ranger. He came here in 1921. He had been over on the other side in Estes Park. He was over there working for the Rocky Mountain National Park, and they transferred him over here. He was the only ranger on this side, and they said, all you have to do is patrol the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park and make sure nothing bad happens. He had 200 square miles to make sure nothing bad happened. In the picture that you see, this is Fred McLaren. The only thing that the National Park Service gave him as a ranger in 1921 was his flat hat, the ranger hat. He owned his own horse, he owned his own saddle, his own chaps, his own gun, his own clothes, but they did give him that nice flat hat so that everybody would know him as a park ranger. I'm good friends with his granddaughter, and that's where the picture came from. But Fred McLaren was wonderful. He served a number of years at Rocky Mountain National Park, and 3 of his sons grew up and went into the National Park Service. Only one of them ever worked at Rocky, but between the 4 of them in that one family, they dedicated 155 years to the National Park Service. Amazing family, very dedicated. And here's just a few of the law enforcement park rangers today. You see them on horseback because all of the park rangers, the law enforcement park rangers in Rocky Mountain National Park are also horse qualified because they have to go backcountry on search and rescue sometimes, but also just patrolling. So they're all horse qualified. But finally, in the 1970s, and you see 2 of them in this picture, they allowed women to be park ranger, law enforcement rangers and carry guns. I think that is so fantastic. I think it's just wonderful that they finally allowed them to do that. So, and this is just a few of them. 3 of the people in that picture, since this was taken 4 years ago, have moved on from Rocky. There's only one of them that's still a law enforcement ranger here. Another great use of a horse-mounted park ranger in Rocky Mountain National Park. Well, of course, it's to herd tourists. Well, if you look closely, down almost in the center of the picture, down to the left, there's a lady in a flat hat. That's a park ranger, and she's giving an interpretive talk, and the ranger on horseback just literally happened to ride up behind all of them. But the park rangers love this picture. They love me telling it, and they love to say that they're herding some tourists because the guys with the guns, they really hate giving out tickets. They really don't like to at all. Many of them have never pulled their gun on a person in the park or anything like that. They want to instruct you and help you get around the park safely and yet take care of you. One of my favorite programs in the National Park Service, and this happens in Rocky Mountain National Park, but almost all national parks and now even some national forests have a junior ranger program. You can take your children or your grandchildren and they meet with a ranger, they get a booklet, and then the kids are asked to go out into Rocky Mountain National Park and wander around, go identify some plants and some bugs and some of the animals. And then they go back and they meet with a ranger again at any of the visitor centers. And the ranger will talk to them and say, okay, what did you really find? How much did mom help you fill out the booklet? That kind of thing. But they go and they don't grill the children, of course, but they talk to them and they show them about Rocky and how important it is. Those kids get to stand up and have a picture taken with the ranger's flat hat on. And then they raise their right hand and say, I promise to take care of Rocky Mountain National Park. I think it's one of the most wonderful programs in the National Park Service because these are the stewards of all of our national parks in the future. After they raise their right hand and say, I promise to take care of Rocky, they're issued a junior ranger badge. I have seen kids in Rocky Mountain National Park with 30 of these things all over a vest. They visited other national parks and they are so proud of them. This is truly a badge of honor for these children. So when you have the opportunity, any national park, talk to them about the Junior Ranger program and get these kids interested in helping preserve the future of our national parks. The past, the present, and the future are really one. They're today. You know, that's as relevant today as it was when Harriet Beecher Stowe said this over 150 years ago. It's important that we protect and preserve our national parks for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for being here today. I know that they've been gathering some questions, and Michaela's going to help me out and tell me what some of those questions you've been asking, and I'll be glad to answer any I possibly can.
All right, Dave, well, I do just want to say thank you so much. That was excellent, as always. You're always one of our favorite speakers. Thank you for coming in and meeting with us today. So one of the questions we did have was just where can viewers and guests learn more about Grand Lake and the west side of Colorado? What are some good resources for that?
Some of the best resources, especially about the Grand Lake area, are online at the Grand Lake Chamber of Commerce or online at my website, livelytoursandtalks.com. They can gather more information about what I do and some of the information that I share about Rocky Mountain National Park. I also give private guided tours from Grand Lake into Rocky Mountain National Park. And then Rocky Mountain National Park has their own website. It's kind of in depth and it's very long, but you can find your way through it and gather a lot of information, not just about the history of Rocky, but about the plants, about the animals, about some of the stories that you will.
Oh, Dave, it sounds like maybe we've lost you.
Is that better?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I lost you for a couple seconds also. I'm sorry.
Oh, so you cut out just before you finished the question. Do you mind just kind of picking it up from the tail end?
Oh, I was just talking about the different websites and the information available through Rocky Mountain National Park or the Grand Lake Chamber of Commerce or my website. You'll find all kinds of additional information on my website about the private tours that I conduct in Rocky and that kind of thing also.
Excellent. And then my other question, do you have a particular favorite trail in Rocky?
Where you want to go, how far you want to go, and whether it's a family or whether you have children. We have a great, for instance, handicapped accessible trail that's only half a mile long, but it's along the side of the Colorado River. We have other trails such as the Onahu Trail, named after the horse that goes up. It's an 8.5-mile loop. And it's a wonderful trail. You follow the Onahu Creek. I often go up there with a lunch and sit next to just the cascades on the creek with my lunch and enjoy no sounds but the running water. And the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park has so many fewer visitors that you can be on some of those trails and not see another person for several hours sometimes.
Well, that sounds just lovely. I can't wait to get out there and check it out myself. Well, I don't necessarily know that we have any additional questions, but Dave, I do want to say thank you again for being here. We really appreciated it. We always do. And I'm sure we'll see you again in the winter.
Well, Michaela, thank you very much. You and your staff are wonderful. I know when I've been there in person, the people that enjoy the Frisco Historic Park and the museum always make great comments about the great museum that you have. And I've wandered through it many times and I love being there. So thank you very much for having me again today.
Of course, Dave, thank you. And folks, thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live, on our website, whatever medium you're watching on. Remember that on July 29th, we will be back with another virtual lunchtime lecture. So keep watching out for more information.